In the first part of this deconstruction series, I'm going to take a look at the drums and the bass of this track. Now, getting the drums and bass right in a dance track is a very essential part of making sure that your mix is right. If you don't get this bit right, the rest of it isn't going to work very well at all. So to do this, I've now got a loop on here, and I'm just going to solo up all of the drum elements. Now, in this mix, everything's been rendered to audio, which, to be honest with you, is a preferred way of working. It separates out the production and the writing stage from the mix stage, and I think psychologically that's a really good way to work. Now, this has been color coded into different sections to make it a lot easier to see what's going on, and you can see, for example, that the main drum parts here have all been coloured green, and I've also taken advantage of Logic's track stacks to create a track stack here for a drum bus, for which I've then used extra processing, which I'll get to in a minute. So let's bring up the basic drum track as it stands. So if we go around to the mixer here and we take a look at the individual elements, we're going to start with the kick drum. Now, with this kick drum, what I have done is attempted to keep the overall level at around about minus 8 dB. Now, I'm aiming for an overall level on the master of around about -6 at the end. This is going to give plenty of headroom for any potential mastering at the later stages, but also it means that I'm sure that I'm not going to get any clipping on the master output. Now let's go and have a look at the EQ on here. Now there's some fairly subtle EQ on this kick drum. I think what I generally find is if you're doing drastic EQ cuts or boosts at this particular stage, then it's probably right that the sound itself isn't right, and it's better to go back and look at the original sound, so in this case the kick drum. Now hopefully if you've got to the mixing stage, that won't be so much of a problem. So what I've kind of done here is I've removed a fair amount of the low frequency here using a low cut. Now the decision I've made with this is that the bass is going to be carrying all of the sub weight. If you have a kick drum and a bass all carrying lots of sub information, it can get into a bit of a mess down in the lower frequency ranges. So with this in mind, I've kind of made that decision fairly early on. Now I'm also using a kind of resonant boost here at around about 60 Hertz, just to give it a bit more of a thump. Now I've taken out about -6 dB at around 200 Hertz here, just to sort of scoop out this range. And again, this is something that plays into the bass when I bring it in later on. And then I've given it a bit of a boost up at the higher regions. Now the thing about a kick drum like this, or generally about kick drums, is it's not just about the low frequency information. You want to make sure that the kick cuts through in the mix, and a boost in the upper frequency regions can really help. So if I bring this back in again with the rest of the drums, so once we've got the EQ sorted on here, the next thing I've done is I've added some fairly gentle compression. Now, this is using one of Logic 10.1's new compressors, and I've got to say I am really impressed with these. They've certainly been a big update on the previous version, and it gives lots of hands-on access to more information on the compressor than you had before. So as I said, I've got very gentle compression going on here. I'm using auto release, and I'm just using a very, very short attack here, really just to tame it in. Now if I bypass this, you'll see what I mean. Just to kind of tighten up the drum sound itself. And then I followed that with Logic's Envelope plugin. Now this is a bit of a secret weapon here. I've just added a little bit of an attack to it, just to make it sort of punch through, just to catch those initial transients. And I've just taken some of the release off again, just to tighten it up. So if you listen to the difference. And let's hear that in isolation. And again with the compressor. So if you take those out, and back in again. Now, moving on to the clap. This clap was a little bit problematic in the way it had been put together. Let me just take off all the plugins and you'll see what I mean. So firstly, there is a lot of stereo information here. The clap itself has been panned over, or one of the claps in this bounce has been panned over to the right-hand side. And you can see that there is a big volume difference between each of the claps, which you can see probably a little bit more clearly if you actually come over here and have a look at the waveform. Zoomed very far in on the waveform on the clap here, you can actually see the transient peaks here between these different claps are very different. Now this proved to be quite problematic in terms of getting a consistent level out of the clap. So what was done was a chain of effects to really come to grips with this clap sound. So the first thing was a gain plugin is used to mono up the sound. Now I made a decision in this that I wanted most of my main drum elements, those that I really want to punch through, to be mono, so that essentially they are cutting right through. So there's the first bit. And now in terms of EQ, there's a fairly drastic EQ going on here. Lots of low cut and a big boost around about 550 hertz with a high shelf here just to bring out the top. And then I followed this up with a gate. Now, gates are really very, very useful and tend to be a little bit overlooked when it comes to working in a digital environment. Ultimately, they were used in analog days for removing noise. But what this enables me to do is just to tighten up that clap sound with the highest transient peak. Now, following that, we're then using one of the VCA compressors, really, really quick. And let me just bring this in. This is the difference that makes. So not using a particularly high ratio on this. I've got the threshold down to -20. And crucially, what I'm doing here is I'm making use of auto gain. So essentially, this is returning the gain to 0 dB. But the idea is that I'm using a very heavy limiter here to really, really, really grab the sound. Now, what I really like about these new compressors is you have the ability to trim both input and output gain. The actual gain structure of a sound is very, very important. Getting that sound into each of the plugins at a healthy level is really, really going to help with the sonic quality of the sound that you're using. So this now means that with healthy levels going in, I'm now able to control the output gain on this control here, and you can see that I've backed that off so that it balances up really well with the kick and the clap. So let me just drop these back out. Now the hats, let's just bring the hats in here. Let me just zoom back out again. And I'm going to bring them in now with some of the other hats that are in use. So there's a fair amount of hats being used in this track. Let me just solo up. So I've created another bus here to route all of the top end into. And I'm making use of just some very basic EQ really, nothing too much to write home about here. Some of these sounds are making use of the enveloper. Just to tighten that up again, bring out the transient attack. And then I'm using a compressor on the hat bus, and I'm sidechaining this from the kick drum to kind of give a really nice rhythmic pump to the hi-hat. Some of the effects that are on the go there as well. So with all these sounds in place, I'm then routing them through to the drum bus over here. You'll notice that I have two channel EQs here, and I'm using them for mid-side decoding. Now, mid-side decoding involves using two channels. You have a mid channel, which is where information in the stereo field is the same in the left and right channel, and then you have side, where there is difference in the left and right channel. Now, using these two EQs, I can process and EQ the mid and the side separately. This means that I can EQ the kick and the clap, which are sitting in the middle of this mix, and the hats, which are wider out in the stereo field, separately. And this is something that we look at in the course. Now I'm following this up with Lufticus. This is a wonderful little plugin, and I'm just using this to give a kind of high boost. And what I can do, let me just put this up to around 10k. And boost this at the top here. Gives a really nice lift on those upper frequencies. We then have a bus compressor using the Vintage Opto here, just to smooth things out. Almost no compression at all going on here. Just gluing things together really nicely. And then I'm following that with this Flux Stereo tool, which means I can now just very gently widen out the stereo information. This gives me a really nice set of processing on my drums. Let's bring that back in again now. So with the drums in place, the next stage is to work on the bass. So the bass is separated into two sections here. Let's just come over and have a look at this. What I've got is I've got a sub. Now this sub, I've made a decision to really focus in on the low end here. And I'm just going to leave that pretty much as is. And then there is a top bass, which is blending. Now, kind of getting a balance between these two basses really is a matter of taste. But I felt that there's enough sort of low-mid information in here that I wanted to keep. You can hear that's compressing quite heavily. So these are then routed through to a bus. Personally, I think one of the strengths of Logic is the way that its busing system works. It's incredibly useful in mixed situations. And then I've added a very simple stereo delay onto this top bass, just to give it a little bit of movement and a bit of stereo width. Now, one of the things about using delays is the more feedback you use, the more potential there is for the repeats to essentially kind of mess up your mix. So what I've done is I've removed all of the feedback. I generally tend to find that you generally need half of the feedback that you think you do when you start putting delays on stuff. I've also made the use of the low and the high cut here to really narrow the range of the repeats, the frequency range of the repeats. So I'll bring this back in again. And let's bring it in just on the basses together. Now the compressor on this top bass is really there just to kind of keep the sound with the filter open and the sound with the filter closed at a consistent level. I'm making use of a little bit of limiting on this as well. Again, this is another one of the compressor flavors that are open to you with this new Logic update. And again, like I said earlier, these are all great, really feeling them all. So now that I've got this balanced, I can balance the two sounds up against each other, the bass bus and the drum bus. Now, I've made a decision with this that I want the drums to be pretty dry. I like that kind of tight drum sound here, but I've made a slight concession. Over here you can see there's a bus send from the drum bus, and it's leading over to a return channel with Logic's Space Designer on it. But I've used drum reverb, and I'm using a very, very, very short drum reverb, by using the volume envelope. Let me show you what I mean. I can bring this volume attack like this, and it starts to sound a bit more kind of roomy. By shortening these up, like this, let me just bring this all the way over, I can kind of create this sense of just a kind of, again, it's a kind of a gluing, it's a sense of coherency by putting all of the upper frequencies. Now, I've also used a roll-off here so that I want to keep all my sub-frequencies as kind of clear as I can. And that just adds a nice little sense of space and coherency to the drums. Now, with the kind of drums and the bass all working together nicely, it's time to move on and have a look at the other sounds in the mix.